someone out there has received the diagnosis of primary progressive MS, how would you describe it?
I think from a biological perspective, looking under the microscope, studying the disease, MS is actually only one disease. It's multiple sclerosis. Then we have what we call the clinical subtypes, and there's two broad types there. People have relapse onset, where they have a definite attack. It comes on usually over hours to days. With primary progressive disease, they don't have the attack onset. What happens is they develop the insidious creeping up, usually a problem in one particular neuronal system. It's usually the lower limbs. The most common is they'll start off noticing maybe a dropping of a foot or weakness of a foot. It typically comes on after exercise when they've been walking or running. And then what happens is gradually over months to years, that gets worse and worse and worse. Now, to be honest with you, Kaz, the proportion of people who have primary progressive disease, in the past studies was about 10 to 15%. It's actually got smaller now. So most studies now suggest that only 1 in 20 people present with primary progressive. In other words, 19 out of 20 people will have the attack onset. And we don't know why. What's actually happening is the primary progressive disease, in terms of the number of new cases, is staying relatively constant. What's actually increasing is the number of attack onset MS. And what's happening is the proportion is getting lower.
It's still multiple sclerosis, it's the same condition, but it affects people in different ways. I mean, I know you said that we don't know, but is there any reason why that happens?
What happens with relapse onset disease is because they get the attack, they get diagnosed a decade earlier, 10 or more years earlier. Because what happens is, what brings them to the attention of the medical profession, neurologists, is the fact that they had an attack. Now, because people with primary progressive disease don't get diagnosed much earlier, by the time they arrive at the neurologist, they've lost a lot of reserve capacity in that particular pathway. Every time you have an attack, you may lose nerve fibers, but what happens is there's enough what we call residual capacity for that pathway to recover function, so they get better.
I first initially got symptoms around 2001. Obviously, cut a long story short, I went to doctors, GPs, etc. And obviously, there was no diagnosis, but obviously 4 or 5 years later, and that's probably that reserve capacity there, because we didn't know quite what I had at the time. And it was just a very confusing time, but the symptoms weren't that profound that it was causing a major problem. It was more of an inconvenience.
The average time for somebody with primary progressive disease to be diagnosed is over 4 years. So how long did it take you from your first noticing that temperature sensitivity to being diagnosed?
I think probably, well, I didn't realize it was the temperature sensitivity at the time, but probably around 2000 to 2002, I thought something's not quite right. Like I was running on the football pitch, but I couldn't quite run full speed. 2006, I thought, I'm walking 100 yards and my legs turning into lead.
There you've got the 4-year gap, 2002.
Well, this is what I mean. So when you're saying it, it kind of makes perfect sense. What options do we have?
Well, there are two types of treatments. So we have the therapies that are given to modify the disease, in other words, slow it down. It's called disease modifying. And we only have, at this point in time, one therapy that works, has been licensed in that space. It works against B cells. It's an anti-CD20 therapy called ocrelizumab. The other part are what we call symptomatic treatments. So, if you've got spasms, pain, bladder problems, bowel problems, then we can give you medications to manage those symptoms. And those are treatments that are called symptomatic therapies. They don't modify the course of the disease. In other words, the disease still continues to gradually get worse over time, but they just improve the symptoms.
You either deal with the symptoms or you deal with the therapies. I mean, you try to modify the disease. So that probably for the first time makes a lot more sense than from the way I've kind of understood it in the past. We read a lot about other MS therapies in terms of physio, cognitive, speech, language. I mean, there's different types of therapies. I mean, can people with PPMS or primary progressive MS access these as well?
Absolutely. I mean, so what you're talking about are the physical therapies.
Oh, right. Okay.
And the physical therapies are as important as the medications we prescribe, because, as you know, in the way the brain works, if you don't use it, you lose it. If somebody's got a problem with, say, hand function, unless they do rehabilitation exercises, in other words, use their hands, then that hand is going to not work. It's going to get worse quicker.
Primary progressive MS is generally diagnosed later than relapsing remitting MS, as people with PPMS don't experience attacks. There is currently only one DMT successfully used to treat primary progressive MS, ocrelizumab. However, there is also a wide range of other therapies which can improve the outcomes for those living with PPMS. Studies on new treatments for PPMS are constantly being undertaken.
I hope you found that video useful. You can find more MS content on our channel or click the link to watch the next MS video.